Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here to talk about what it's like to study the New Testament at Harvard as a Catholic. Let me begin by just apologizing for this impromptu stream. I was originally trying to record this video on my computer, but then I realized that I would like to actually interact with people while I talk about, this first experience at Harvard. And then also, I don't know, just a live stream just feels more natural because sometimes when you're just talking to a recording, you don't feel as great. But then knowing that you could potentially be talking to fans and just onlookers, that feels a lot more human to me. And so, of course, also as I began doing the live stream, actually, Sebastian joined me. And so this is great. So you're actually getting to see my cat. And I guess maybe this is a sign that I should have done the live stream first instead of just trying to record this video multiple times. And so, once again, as I said before, the subject of my video, oh, the cat has left me. All right. The subject of today's video is what it's like to study the New Testament at Harvard as a Catholic. And so I'm going to break down the video into three different parts. The first is just what my specific program at Harvard is. And then, second, the four classes that I took this semester. And then finally, I'll talk about my five key takeaways from my New Testament class. So, regarding my program at Harvard, I'm currently studying the New Testament and early Christianity at Harvard Divinity School, and I'm pursuing the MTS, or the Master of Theological Studies degree, which is a 2-year degree. And then from there, we'll see where the Lord wills. I'm excited actually when the time comes to share with you where I'm applying and what my next steps are going to be. And please keep me in your prayers because obviously to get funding for education, that's very important. And so, especially since some of my dreams are pretty big, we'll see, what God wills and, where you can help me. So the second thing I want to talk about are the four classes I took this semester. And the four classes are elementary Greek, theories and methods, Jewish and Christian law in the first centuries at Harvard Law School, and then finally, introduction to the New Testament. So, just regarding each of these classes, my instructor for my elementary Greek class is an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And when he graded our quizzes and exams, he was very merciful, very compassionate. And if we ever got like something wrong with our Greek translations, he was very gentle. And he kind of gave you the compliment sandwich. So he would say, "Oh, that's pretty good. You just got to work on this, but you're doing great." He would give you the compliment sandwich. And so I really love my Greek professor or instructor. And next semester, I'll be having him again to continue my studies in Greek. And I just really love how he took a lot of the pressure out of studying a new language because sometimes that can be pretty intimidating, but he made you feel like you weren't dumb, if you got something wrong. And he also struggled sometimes along with us because even I've learned this actually, even New Testament scholars, they need to constantly brush up on their Greek and prepare themselves. And he also knew that I was Catholic, and I could tell that he was one of like the very like ecumenical kind of Eastern Orthodox Christians. And so we didn't have any tension. He treated me like a brother, and so I really appreciated that. The next class I took was methods, and this is basically the introduction to the academic study of religion. So the class explored questions like, should we still use the category world religions or not? Do all religions have sacred texts and doctrines like Christianity? Should Christianity be the prototype for studying every other religion? These are the kinds of questions we asked, and it was an interesting class. Now, the last two classes I want to talk about are Jewish and Christian law in the first centuries and Introduction to the New Testament. So, regarding Jewish and Christian law in the first centuries, the professor was a visiting professor from Israel, so she wasn't part of like the Harvard Law faculty. But still, regardless, Harvard Law hosted her, provided her with all the resources she needed, and I enjoyed the class. Especially, I enjoyed when she talked about the Talmud because that's her area of expertise. I think she did her dissertation at Yale on that particular that particular document, or rather compilation of documents. And what was interesting about reading the Talmud and also reading kind of early, church councils, especially, or even church synods, not like the big ecumenical councils, but we even read the smaller ones, was that you saw Christians and Jews, despite what you would think, actually retained good relations. Now, of course, there were also strains of or strands of Jews and Christians who didn't get along. So I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture, but sometimes we have a very simplistic view that Jews and Christians just always, after the first century, were at odds and hated each other. But no, actually, then the history is more complicated. There were actually like stories about Christians who would, go to mass, and then after mass they would go to like Jewish bars and pubs, or maybe bars is the right word, not pubs. But anyway, they would go and drink and dine and have fun with their Jewish friends. And it was just interesting to see. And this is like even, I think, pre-Nicaea, some of the evidence that we looked at. And so it shows you that very early on, even though Jews and Christians were aware of their tensions and their differences, many of them, or at least a number of them, I should say, were able to retain good friendships and relationships. And so that was really fascinating. Um, Now, when it comes to the introduction to New Testament class, let me just say very briefly before I get into the five takeaways from there that um, regarding introduction to New Testament, it was funny because some of my friends were saying in the class, "Swan, why are you in this class? You don't need this class." And I think that's very nice of them, but I think everybody at times needs to go back to the basics. And so I kind of wanted to just make sure I have my grasp on the basics, and I could use this professor, use not in a bad way, but like I ask this professor questions about what's the current state of scholarship and get myself up to date on anything. Because with respect to like the Gospel of Matthew or even the Gospels, I think I'm pretty good on those. But then when it comes to a lot of the like the shorter epistles, I'm kind of like, okay, I could use maybe some brush up on what the scholarship says. Anyway, um, so it was really fun to be in that class. The thing was, this semester, or this past semester, the other New Testament courses required prior knowledge in Greek. So I think there was like a Gospel of Luke class, and there was the an Apocrypha class, and you needed prior advanced knowledge in Greek. And so I'm just starting with Greek. I did Latin during my undergrad, and so I wasn't ready for that. So they had Introduction to the New Testament, and I said, hey, why not? All right. So with that out of the way, then here are my five key takeaways from studying the New Testament at Harvard so far. So the first thing I want to talk about are the students in my class. So Harvard Divinity School is one of the most pluralistic divinity schools in the world. Actually, it is the most pluralistic divinity school in the world. The greatest number of traditions are represented in the student body. And so in that class, there were people who were, non-religious, who were Buddhists, who were Hindu. Some of my classmates in other classes were Buddhist monks, Hindu monks. There were people of, let's say, I'm trying to think, various Jewish traditions in the class. So other kinds of Christians. So I'm just saying that like this was a very diverse class, and some of the people actually had never read the New Testament or the Bible before. So this was their first time actually reading the text. And so I want to give you then what their impressions were of the New Testament, these students who had never read it before. So regarding Jesus, one moment that I remember in my discussion section was a Jewish girl who had never read the New Testament, and actually, she had never even, I don't think she had even read the Hebrew Bible, which is, there's a story behind that. I don't want to get into her personal life, but anyway, I'm not judging her. Um, it was her first time reading the Bible ever, and especially the New Testament, and she said that she, growing up, had heard about this kind of like hippie, lovey-dovey, Barney Jesus, basically. And she said when she read the New Testament, she didn't find that anywhere. The Jesus of the New Testament is actually quite frightening. He's quite intense, divisive. And, a lot of Christians to whom I've told that were actually appreciative that, she didn't have going in or extracted out of the text this kind of hippie Jesus, because Jesus of the New Testament is actually quite intense. And that was actually the thoughts of a lot of students in the class, that Jesus is a very intense and frightening figure. Uh, I asked other students about their thoughts on Paul, and it was interesting because a lot of them said that they thought Paul was insecure. Paul was maybe figuring out as he went along. He didn't really sometimes seem to have a coherent theology, or kind of, you can see in the document, it's not really a philosophical treatise. It's him writing out his thoughts as he went along. And so you have to kind of be careful with the argument and where it's going. So anyway, those were the impressions that some students had of the class. One thing that surprised me was that there were a lot of students who wanted ideological diversity. They didn't just want the critical debunking, sometimes deconstructing readings of the New Testament. They actually wanted to hear, how did the church fathers interpret the New Testament? How do faithful Christians, devout Christians today interpret the document? So I had, for example, a Muslim friend of mine who wanted to know these answers. And he was not coming at it from a perspective of, I want to debunk Christianity. and see what the early Christians said. This Muslim friend of mine was coming at it from a genuine place of, I just want to know how they interpret the document, because he wanted to see, with his own like study of the Quran and his own religious beliefs, how maybe he can learn from the Christian tradition. And then sitting next to me in class, very good Jewish friend of mine, and he said that he found, like, for example, the Gospel of John to be beautiful, certain parts of the New Testament to be very moving. And this was his first time reading through the whole New Testament. He had read excerpts of it before. I just want to share a quick story about him. There was a day in class where he and the professor were disagreeing on how to interpret a text in the book of Deuteronomy. And he pulled out the Hebrew text on his phone of Deuteronomy and read it. That was the coolest thing that I'd ever seen anybody do. And so this friend of mine, super awesome. And, I'm kind of sad because I don't think we're taking any classes together next semester. But, I think we'll stay in contact. But anyway, he was also interested in like hearing the harmonizations between differences between the gospels, or even differences maybe between Acts and Paul on chronology, so forth. And so he wanted to actually hear out the Christian perspective on the text, and he actually appreciated the New Testament for its beauty. And I think we even had a discussion on the first or second day of class where he asked me, Swan, why do Christians think that God had to kill somebody in order to forgive us? And I told this friend of mine that, yeah, there are some, Christians, some Protestants who believe that. But even there are Protestants and even there are Catholics who don't have that perspective, Eastern Orthodox who don't have that perspective. And I explained to him the incarnation, Christus Victor, aspects of penal substitutionary atonement that are correct. Other parts that I think are kind of, if you don't have Christus Victor, become too, let's say, legalistic in its understanding of what Christ did on the cross, what God did in, when he was incarnate. And so I remember I was explaining all this to him, and he actually really liked it. He thought it was beautiful, the incarnation and how all of that works within the Christian soteriology. All right, so that's the first thing I'll say about my key takeaway. There are a lot of interesting first impressions from students. The second thing was that the professor was ruffling feathers. And so the professor would sometimes propose multiple interpretations of a single verse or chapter or book. And we knew that his point, my friends and I, we knew that his point was to kind of, shake up maybe the students in class who were raised in a more conservative or evangelical reading of the New Testament. And so in my office hours with the professor, or rather, when I was in his office hours, the professor talked about how some of the students were actually distressed because they were realizing that this document that they thought was perspicuous, if I got that right. They realize that actually it's very complicated and it's actually difficult to kind of synthesize things sometimes. And so the kind of simple Christianity and catechesis that they might have had, um, they were starting to see that the text is not that simple and that there are difficulties. And so it was interesting because he asked me, like, Swan, what do you think about this? And I just said, hey, I'm enjoying like learning about the New Testament from a critical perspective. Although, like, given my background, I knew a lot of these kind of critical points already. I had my own thoughts about them. But it was just interesting to know that there were a lot of students in that class who were actually disturbed because the professor was showing that, with the Greek, or even, yeah, with the Greek, or just even in context, you could read documents in multiple ways. And I think a lot of students left that New Testament class suspicious if there is actually a unified theology, throughout the Old and New Testament, or even within the New Testament. I think the impression that a lot of students left with is that there was just early conflict and multiple kind of fractured Christianities. Maybe there was some type of core like the resurrection, but they kind of left wondering, is there a unity to scripture? And so I actually feel like one day that's the whole point of biblical theology, right? The whole point of biblical theology, aside from, other things that one can talk about, biblical theology, the whole point of it is to show the unity of the old and the new, to show points of continuity, and to try to see how do both testaments fit together. At least that's how I see the project of biblical theology. I know there are others who might have other perspectives, but I think one thing I wished in that class was that we got more of maybe biblical theology, ancient Christian interpretation, and those sorts of things, because even there were students in the class who weren't Christian who wanted to actually hear about how do Christians synthesize the text. They were genuinely curious and didn't want to just dismiss the Christian tradition, which is very, I guess, interesting for me. So the third thing that I want to point out now, and I mentioned it before, is perspicuity. So, I'm right now reviewing Casey Chalk's book on the obscurity of scripture, where he critiques perspicuity. So let me just pull it up here. I'm right now reviewing the book. Um, don't worry, this isn't a paid promotion or anything. A journal invited me to review it, and so I'm happy to do it. And anyway, I think this class showed me that if you're going in with this idea of perspicuity, um, I think it's pretty I want to be careful here because when you try to debunk perspicuity, I know that there are also Catholics, and I'm sympathetic to this, who are saying, okay, then are you just saying the text is obscure and useless? No, 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 there's not that. But the point is that, let's say, if the church is just like a university where there isn't, let's say, a capacity to actually form and make law and have a binding definition of doctrine and dogma, then it's really easy to see how the church ends up looking like academia. Because academia, you have these brilliant exegetes, people who know Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and Old Church Slavonic and know the textual manuscripts and what have you. And they can show you, oh, there are different textual traditions. There are different ways in which someone can read this text and come to another conclusion. And so it just showed me that the idea of perspicuity just really doesn't stand up to scrutiny, or at least if you try to have perspicuity, you have to make it so thin, because some people will narrow down perspicuity to just what's necessary for salvation. And if something isn't clear, then it isn't necessary for salvation. That's kind of how at least some people view it. I know that there are multiple ways of defining the term, or applying it even. But the basic point is that perspicuity, if you think that the text alone is enough, it's not. Because the text alone can get you certain things, yes, but then you also need tradition to help you see certain things, and then you also need the guiding hand of the ecumenical councils and the ex cathedra degrees of the Pope to help you. And it was interesting for me because as a Catholic sitting in that class, when the professor would point out you can interpret this document multiple ways and that there are difficulties here, I kind of thought, well, yeah, I mean, it's nice that at least I have a magisterium, or that I have, at least I can believe in the oral tradition of the apostles and use that as an exegetical guide. Whereas for a lot of people, I think, who just were raised on sola scriptura, if this is all you have, then it's going to be really difficult. And so, actually, for me as a Catholic, it was easier for me to just kind of admit and look at the text and say, yeah, I see what you're saying, professor. You can interpret this multiple different ways, and that there are, valid debates if you're just working without a magisterium or the oral tradition of the fathers, or excuse me, of the apostles through the fathers. And that kind of bled into my fourth point, which was just me realizing that the church, at least when I listen to some, very intelligent Protestant theologians, if you don't have a magisterium, and if you don't have, I mean, yeah, and the guiding oral tradition of the apostles, then the church just becomes like a playground for the theologians, to use Pope Benedict's term. It looks a lot like academia. Well as something that I noticed about Catholicism is that part of our conception of the church, aside from the fact that yes, it is, we view the church as mother, we view the church as a sacrament and as the wellspring of the sacraments. We also understand that the church is a well-ordered society. And so it does have the capacity to make law. It does have the capacity to declare dogma. It's not like other academic institutions, because it's not supposed to be. There is supposed to be intellectual engagement with the text, with the oral tradition of the apostles, with the church fathers, with the magisterium. But ultimately, what makes the church united and what makes us a well ordered society is that the church has the capacity to enforce or declare law. And on top of that, um, of course, like Protestants will point out, well, we also have councils, we also have, governing bodies and disciplinary procedures. But the thing is, you need something that's infallible to be governing. Because, for example, let's just, some people will say, well, why not have just the inerrant text of scripture and fallible counsels? Well, let's imagine for a moment that this text of scripture is errant. That means that it has errors. What would happen? Okay, well, then obviously you start seeing the problems where then you can start picking and choosing things. You can start saying that one thing cancels out another thing. You could construct basically your own Christianity and debunk and dismiss other parts, or you can create your own canon, even. If you think that, well, let's say there is no difference between Enoch and the Gospel of Matthew. And so my point here is that if you look at this problem where you have an errant text, then you have even like a worse problem of just sifting sands. Whereas if the church, so there's that. But if the text is inerrant, then there's a sense in which you have to reckon yourself to it. You have to work with it, and so you can't just dismiss it. But then when you start seeing that a text, even if it's inerrant, isn't enough to govern and unite God's people, then you start realizing that you need a magisterium. And so that's kind of my kind of like a rough form of the argument in my head at the moment. But I just started realizing, like, okay, yeah, this is actually something I think is different between a Catholic and a Protestant view, because I think it's precisely correct to say that yes, you need an inerrant text, but you also need an infallible magisterium. That is necessary. It's not optional. It's not extra. It is necessary if you're going to have a text as well. And so the last thing that I want to talk about is simply Paul and Judaism. And so one thing that I actually really enjoyed about my class was that we got into the recent literature on Paul within Judaism. And, I had studied Paul mainly from the perspective of like the Reformation and Catholic Protestant debates. But the professor wanted to bring in like Paul's perspective on Judaism. And so I want to show you actually some verses that the professor shared in class, because I think these verses are actually really fascinating. Let's see here. Okay, so if you look here, it has, for example, Galatians 3:21. Is the law then opposed to the promises of God? Certainly not. Romans 3:1. Then what is the advantage of the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. Or Romans 3:31. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. Romans 7:7. What then should we say? That the law is sin? By no means. 7:12. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good. Romans 9:4. To the Israelites belong to the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. Romans 11:1. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. 11:26. And so all Israel will be saved. 11:29. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So of course there are questions about how do you interpret these passages. Some people are also going to point out, well, Suan, he's cherry picking these passages, and the professor acknowledged that, of course, like you want to be careful if you're just going to prove text. But he just wanted to point out, like, okay, there's an interesting theme, at least, that you can pick up in these verses, which is that Paul didn't view Judaism as, let's say, something that has been that is now irrelevant. He still viewed Jews and Israel as part of God's plan. And so I thought it was just fascinating to see this material. And also, I read a commentary by a professor at Harvard named Shia Cohen in the Jewish Annotated New Testament. He wrote the introduction to Galatians, his little commentary. And Shia Cohen, very famous professor and rabbi, he says in his commentary that like Paul never tells practicing Jews to stop or to give up the law. And I thought that was a really fascinating point. And so I have a lot of thoughts actually reading, what Paul is saying here, because it seems to me that Paul is saying, look, everybody is justified, Jew and Gentile is justified by Jesus Christ and his work on the cross. But Paul seems to say, Jews, if you want to continue practicing the law, that's good, because the law is a gift from God. It was something given to our forefathers, and so it's meant for us. But the Gentiles, they don't have to practice the law, and don't even make it, much less don't make it a condition for justification, because it's not. And so it's interesting then to read Paul in that way and what that might mean for Jewish and Christian relations, because the law is not a burden, it's a gift. The law is something given to the Jewish people. And so reading that just made a lot of things kind of click together in my head with Paul. And then also Matthew Thiessen has a book I think it's called Paul and the Gentile Problem. Let me check that real quick because he talks about, yeah, Paul and the Gentile Problem, that's what it's called. And he talks about, this issue of justification and why Paul was kind of saying that Gentiles can't practice the law. One professor told me that it's because Gentiles don't have, like, quote unquote, the right blood. I don't know if that's an accurate assessment of his views, but I'm just telling you that's what one professor at Harvard told me is his perspective. But anyway, I'm not going to delve into that. So if you want to ask any questions, I'm more than happy to take questions. And then eventually I do have a job interview coming up. So please keep me in your prayers as that happens. All right. So let's see. Mihoville P asks, how do you like Cambridge? By the way, 5 p.m. mass at St. Paul's is great. So I'm interested if you're a fellow student or if you're at Cambridge. Maybe you can email me at icatholicism@gmail.com. But how do I like Cambridge? So um, I really like Harvard's campus, and it's always fun when you're on campus because you see, like, tourists come by and you kinda, there are those memes about, like, when your parents bring home house guests and you just feel like a zoo animal as, they're watching, you, but it's kinda funny because you walk through Harvard's campus, you see all these kids who are very excited and potentially wanna be there, and, and then I just kinda wonder, like, what's going through their heads? What are they thinking about? I'm hoping that they get in, wishing well upon them. But yeah, Harvard has a beautiful campus. Cambridge, coming to Kansas, like, look, something like this, like behind me, I don't think you would see this view in Cambridge. So I really like the open space of Kansas. I really actually miss Kansas quite a bit. But there are definitely beautiful things on Harvard's campus. The academics is very good at Harvard, and also, like, it's funny when you see, like, these famous professors on the news, or even, like, from books that you've read casually walking past you. For example, there's the famous Harvard Law School professor Noah Feldman, and I saw him walk past me twice, and I was just like, "Wow, like, he's there, he's real." Another time too. Let's see here. I was walking to my house. I live in a house with 9 other guys. It's a Catholic house with Opus Dei. And as I was walking to my house, I see this philosophy professor whom I had read during my undergrad, and he was just casually walking by, and I was just like, "This is crazy." Like, I kind of feel like a kid in a candy shop. All right. Kevin non-Stratocath with always the spicy questions. It's good. It's good. Keep me on my toes. Swan. One thing I don't really understand is why the magisterium brings any solace to anyone. Like, why does the fact that the magisterium declared the Latin Vulgate to be, let's see, what is included in the canon mean anything? Why should I care about a decision made 1500 years later unless I am making a faith-based assumption that the magisterium is infallible? Okay, so actually, I mean, I will admit that it is a faith-based assumption, just as my belief that, for example, Jesus Christ is infallible, that the scriptures are inerrant. These are faith-based assumptions, and then these are kind of, building upon a priori considerations about God, about what kind of church he would institute, about how he would go about saving the world. So if you think about, for example, Richard Swinburne's arguments a priori for an incarnation from his conception of God, I think that these are the types of considerations that motivate the idea of inerrancy and infallibility. Um, and so I think I just want to go back really quick to how does the magisterium bring any solace to anyone? I would say it brings solace to me because, on the one hand, the magisterium is a living, breathing testament to the fact that when God wanted his people to be one, he actually instituted a way in which that was possible, that you could actually have this universal teacher, the church and the Pope speaking on behalf of the church to settle, issues that are going to divide the Christian community. Because I also recognize too, like, some people have said to me, some Protestants have said, like, why do we need all these extra dogmas and doctrines? Why don't we just have these essential few? And the reason why we can't just have those essential few is because the church is a living historical reality. And as people go on through the centuries, they ask questions, and there is a need for a rational, systematic theology. And so, if you are just thinking about the church in your present moment, maybe all you need are just maybe 5 main doctrines, right? But as the church goes on in history and people start interpreting and building upon tradition and building upon, and I mean, like, little t tradition, as they start building upon tradition and they have their exegetical ways of, handling the text, and then they come to a conclusion. and that conclusion touches on Christology, that conclusion touches on the nature of the church, or somehow touches upon the nature of God, then if you take this living historical view of the church, which I think is just a fact of history, the church is then going to realize, okay, we need to settle this issue because we need to have this systematic, coherent theology that can span across time. And so, for example, you might have your basic fundamental doctrines in the, in the hierarchy of doctrines and dogmas, like, or the hierarchy of beliefs, like the Trinity, the Incarnation, what have you. But then even these quote unquote little things, they become big things because the whole point of a systematic theology is to come up with a coherent system. The whole point of a biblical theology is to see how these testaments work together. And that is a necessity for people if they're going to take the document seriously, if they are going to believe in the rationality of the Christian faith. And so you need to have that magisterium that is able to offer that final declaration and that solution that everybody has to follow. And so I think it brings solace to me, sorry to get back to the question, because it shows me that God actually cared about uniting his people and actually instituted a way for that to be possible. Now, of course, people have free will. People can still rebel. People can still be disobedient. And so obviously, like, God could have solved that problem by making us all robots as soon as we became Christians. But of course, that's not how God operates. And so to me, it shows that God was serious about unity and he had provided a way. And throughout scripture, whenever God, wills something, he always provides a way for that to actually be possible. And not just like, kind of maybe conceptually possible, actually like materially possible. They can actually go about and finish that mission in question. So, I mean, there are multiple examples that I can give, but I don't want to belabor the point too much. So let's see here. Okay, but how is that position different from sola scriptura? So I miss which position that is exactly. If it's the idea of a magisterium being infallible, then the main difference is that with with the magisterium, because it's a living authority, it can actually actively interpret and give you the interpretation right in front of you. And so, whereas with sola scriptura, you might have all you might have is an inerrant document, and it's pretty, I think, in my opinion, easy to knock perspicuity. So, and there are even some Protestants who try to separate perspicuity from sola scriptura. So, if you just have sola scriptura, you just have an inerrant document. There are still all kinds of problems with how do you interpret it? How do you actually make it capable of governing God's people? Well, the thing is, it has to govern God's people through people reading it and applying it and telling you, what is the tradition? How do we interpret it? And how do we understand it? And so, it reminds me of how the founding fathers, they thought that the Supreme Court would be the least threatening branch of government because all it just has to do is interpret the law. And I don't want to suspect too much, but I feel like they maybe had an implicit, like, maybe Protestant assumption there of perspicuity, and they just applied it to their constitution. They thought, like, yeah, it's going to be easy. They just got to interpret the law. And it's like, no, that's also difficult because then, like, the context change, historical meaning might be lost, other things like that. So I'm just saying that there's definitely an advantage to having a magisterium. I think it shows within human freedom, it is maximally, God is showing his maximal effort within the boundaries of human freedom to unite his people. It's very interesting. Gwip says, thank you for this. It's very interesting reading Paul's letters in that sense. I've had some discussions with the Seventh day Adventists because they believe we're bound to keep the Sabbath because of what Paul says. Yeah, so I've heard of that position before, not from Seventh day Adventists in particular. Um, I need to remember off the top of my head where exactly that is, but or where they might be citing from. But I mean, I do think that Paul didn't have this view that the law should just be dismissed. I think he definitely believed it had a place, at least for Jews, um, because it's a gift, it's a blessing, it's something that God gave out of love through Moses and through and through Moses and to Israel. And so it's not meant to be seen as a burden. But for the Gentiles, it would obviously seem like a burden because that isn't, let's say, the gift that was given to them all those years ago. So I'll just say that right there. Yes. So, and I also agree with Mihovil P that, um, Paul teaches that everybody is justified through Christ, right? So justification is only through Christ. Salvation the law can be a guide, it can be a teacher, but it can't actually deal, let's say, with the sin problem fundamentally. And so, yeah, so I agree there. And I don't want to give the impression that I said like, oh, there's, everybody I think has to go through Christ. And I'm not trying to say that to. I think there's a temptation sometimes to, I guess, make the Bible. I mean, everybody does this, but even in critical scholarship, to make the Bible say what you want it to say. Because some people think like, no, you should have this view that Paul thinks that Jesus is for the Gentiles, and then the Jewish believers have a separate way. But I'm just saying from the text, I think Paul is saying everybody is justified only through Christ, and the law is a gift to the Jewish people. It's not a burden, it's a blessing, but it wasn't given to the Gentiles, for whatever reason, and they're not meant to observe it, right? And so, I think I'm just trying to be fair with the text, and sometimes I think it's actually unfair to, Jewish brothers and sisters if they see us kind of watering down what the text is saying, because then, I think these are things that they want to know, like, what does the text say? What does it say about me? And I think that if we're going to do Jewish and Christian relations better, we need to be honest about these types of things. Because on the one hand, obviously, like, these kind of dangerous anti-Semitic readings or anti-Jewish readings, that has to be nuanced as well. That has to be dealt with. But then on the other hand, these kind of readings where, oh, there's nothing wrong, and there's no expectation of change. Like, okay, that's also a problem, right? We need to, I think, be honest about where each camp is coming from and move forward from there. Or else I don't want the other side to feel like, oh, we've been deceived or you lied to us. And then Mihoville P says, I just live next to campus and often walk my dog through campus. Well, if you're ever available, we should hang out because, yeah, I think that would be a great opportunity. And I appreciate you watching the stream. Kevin says, haha, that's my job. Thanks for taking my question, of course. And then Kevin says, I guess my point here was mostly something like this. If sola scriptura is a faith-based assumption and sola scriptura et magisterium is also a faith-based assumption, they seem on equal footing. So, okay, so let's see here. I mean, they both have faith-based assumptions built into them. And of course, we wouldn't want to say that just because they're faith-based, they're unreasonable. So, for example, sola scriptura, at least part of sola scriptura, I think, is inerrancy. Although maybe you can have, I mean, there are all kinds of like kind of modified versions of even what the reformers said now. So it's kind of hard. It's kind of like trying to define the sand. So you can view them as equal footing insofar as both of them come initially, well, yeah, they come from a faith-based assumption. Although there are reasons, of course, to believe that God would give us an inerrant text, and there are also equally, I think, good reasons to believe that God would give us a magisterium to help us interpret that text. And so, in that way, then I don't think they're on equal footing because they're equal footing in that faith is involved. Sure, maybe that's the case, but they're not equal footing in terms of the fact that I think one just makes more a priori sense than the other given human nature. Because sola scriptura to me just strikes me as very like just untenable to hold. Whereas in reality, like something like a magisterium just seems to me necessary and fundamental to, even if you're going to have a document, you need a corresponding institution that is also infallible to help you interpret that document if the church is a well-ordered society. And I mean, this is an argument that I'm working on, so I haven't finished it yet, but I'll tease it a little bit. But I mean, when you read, for example, uh, the use of the word ecclesia in the New Testament, there's a dissertation by a Korean New Testament scholar. I forget his name at the moment. Um, but he talks about how, when you use the word ecclesia, it means a civic assembly. It has political connotations. And then similarly, Ignatius of Antioch, when he talks about the unity of the church, I think this was from Alastair Stewart's book on the original bishops. Alastair Stewart, I believe, mentions that when Ignatius talks about the unity of the church, he uses terms from Plato to describe the unity of a well-ordered political society. And so if that's the case, then that at least, this idea that the church would also have like a lawmaking faculty and the capacity to settle issues, that seems to be a necessary part, but also that it would have to be infallible. I think that's also something that needs to be considered, because if you just have an inerrant text, but you have fallible human authorities or fallible living authorities, then somebody can always just use Oh, well, my interpretation just comes from scripture itself. They could always use that escape hatch and derail any human authority, any possibility of trying to unite God's people, because they can always just kind of smash that box and say, that glass box, and say, I'm using this now. I have inerrancy. I have the inerrant text in my hands, and everything else is fallible, and I'm interpreting it properly. And then at that point, then the church just becomes like a university, right? And as you know, nowadays, a university, a lot of them don't have a unified vision. They have multiple kind of dogmas and doctrines going on, and so there's that. So Samuel Arguello says, "Forgive the question. It may sound very cliche, but are the teachers hostile to Christians, or should it be qualified?" So that's an interesting question, because I think one thing that surprised me was that my New Testament professor, so I actually, this semester, I wrote a paper for an upcoming book that's coming out. It's an essay, a chapter in a forthcoming volume. And the paper was about Peter's failures in the New Testament, and just what lessons that can teach us about the papacy. And I told the professor, like, could I knock out two birds with one stone and have my final paper, can I have my final paper cover, or can I have this chapter I'm doing cover the final paper assignment? And the professor allowed it. And he said, in fact, I would encourage you to write from your like religious tradition. And so I was fascinated, because I thought he was going to say like, oh no, sorry, that's like too faith-based. And so you can't, submit this for a Harvard Divinity School final project. But no, he accepted it. And so he was very actually excited to read the paper. And I would say that they aren't hostile to Christians, but the expectation is that, I think Harvard's the kind of place where if you say something stupid, it's going to really grill you. And so you need to be careful, right? So you can't come in, let's say, yelling and screaming and trying to own the other side. I think you need to carry yourself with a kind of, well, like maturity, intelligence, poise. And so I wouldn't say that they like, hate Christians, right? Or are hostile to Christians, but I think you just need to be careful how you carry yourself. And I'll also say here too that there are actually some professors who really like Catholics at Harvard. And I won't say who they are exactly, because I want to be careful about like naming people and all that. But like basically, I know of one professor who actually really likes Catholics, and they're not Catholic themselves. So there's that. Kevin, once again, says, I won't get into my thing on a priori knowledge. Instead, I'll leave it here with a note of congratulations on the successful semester and a note of thanks for giving me such a generously long answer. Of course, Kevin, you are always welcomed. And I mean, I enjoy talking to you, and you bring fun questions to the table, and kind of, important questions. And so, yeah, and successful semester. I mean, some professors haven't fully uploaded their grades yet, but I think I ended with straight A's, so we'll see. I know that I ended Greek and theories and methods with straight A's, and then I think New Testament hasn't been graded yet. Jewish and Christian law hasn't been graded yet, so I'm just waiting to hear back on those. But I think I got straight A's. Gabriel Pereira, if I got that right, says, has all your study in Harvard strengthened your faith in Catholicism? So I would definitely say yes. It's kind of funny because um, it strengthened my faith insofar as I see now, like even more clearly. Well, okay. This is actually something really fun. So I'm actually this is exciting. Let me see how much time I have. Okay, so it's really cool right now what's going on in New Testament scholarship and just ancient Judaism scholarship, because one of the first things that I realized was that a lot of things from the Protestant Reformation are falling apart in academia. So like a lot of ideas like perspicuity, um, or even like the old perspective on Paul, like the new perspective is becoming much more popular. And even the idea of, for example, how and there are ancient Jewish texts where they kind of, I mean, they kind of rewrite events in the canonical scriptures, or they add on extra details. And it's interesting because it's showing you right now, and this is a hot thing in New Testament and ancient Judaism scholarship, that these texts that we call pseudepigrapha, or just texts that are outside of the canon, it shows you that ancient Jews did not just constrain everything to the canon of the canonical text of scripture. I talked to one Harvard professor, and she told me that it seems like ancient Jews had this concept of the biblical past, And scripture was one way to access the biblical past. But then another way to access the biblical past was through these these written traditions, like Jubilees, which claims Mosaic authorship, and then even Ben Sura talks about how he discerns infallibly or inerrantly between various traditions. And so what fascinated me is that these documents, which are right now being studied again or studied with greater fervor, and right now are the hot thing in the field, they kind of show you that even ancient Jews had this idea of the biblical past, and they had scripture and they had tradition. Um, and something else I want to point out too is people often cite Josephus as proof of the Protestant canon in particular. But then when you look more closely, like Josephus also talks about things that aren't in the canonical text, but he treats them as if they are part of history, as if they are part of what happened. And so it kind of lends credence to this idea of this general view of a biblical past. And so similarly, like with ancient Christians who also used, the biblical text, and they talk about, the biblical text in grand terms and how it's inerrant and all that. But then they also talked about, oral tradition as also having authority, as also being part of the apostolic past, if you will. And so right now, actually, um, if you're a Catholic, this is a great time actually to be in scholarship. Even the debates on icon veneration and image veneration, a lot of old Protestant notions, even from John Calvin, are now falling apart in scholarship. Now, this doesn't mean that full fledged this doesn't just mean full fledged that the Catholic position is going to go through and that there are no problems. No, I mean there are still problems like within scholarship for just Christians in general, like complications with whether or not there is how soon is the deity of Christ in scripture? Did the historical Jesus think this? So I'm not trying to say that it's all rosy for Catholics either, but I am saying though that at least I think like a lot of the old Protestant beliefs are being hit a lot harder. Whereas, like, I think because Catholics embrace the fact that we need oral tradition and a magisterium, we can absorb these a lot better because we don't put all of our eggs on this basket of scripture, or rather, we don't expect the scriptures to do more than what they can realistically accomplish. Um, so yeah. Shamalama asks, how big are the RCIA classes at the University Center at Harvard? So from what I can tell, because we had a Harvard priest actually, for dinner one time at my house, they continue to bring in, I think, like 30, 40 people. So it's a very constant flow, and it's a lot of people. And also, I haven't ever gone to a Harvard RCIA class, but from what they told me, at least this one priest, their RCIA is like more academically intense, which is to be expected because there are Harvard students who are discerning Catholicism, and so they're kind of they talk about how their intellectual needs are a bit higher. And so, they have like theologians come, they have, all kinds of people. So I think that's what I can say about that. Shamalama also asked, is this your first semester of Greek or do you have previous experience with it? So the summer before I entered Harvard Divinity School, I had a Greek tutor and he gave me a lot of pointers and tips. And so that's at most my prior experience with Greek, aside from maybe like when I did a lot of my past apologetic stuff. Just kind of skimming through and knowing some basic words and things like that. And also, congrats on being a Greek minor. That's going to be very helpful as you go forward. I think one thing I wish I had during my undergrad was more Greek. My institution only offered Latin, and then the professor also knew Greek, but then he offered it after I left. So, it's okay. I'm enjoying learning right now. Lynchpin asks, hey Swan, does the intellectual environment you're in encourage/allow disagreement with the scholarly consensus? How do you personally feel about disagreeing with it? Yeah, so this is a good question. Um, so it's interesting because the question that one should ask is, what do you mean by scholarly consensus? Like on what in particular? Um, because I mean, like for example, maybe one example is where the Gospels. Actually, that's not a good example. There's a consensus, let's say, that only 7 of Paul's letters were actually written by him, right? These are the undisputed letters of Paul. And that's a scholarly consensus that's pretty well established even among conservative evangelical scholars. So are you encouraged or allowed to disagree with it? I think so. But I think you're always going to be expected if you go against the consensus. I mean, because even my professor, I'll say this, he told me like it doesn't really matter what scholars say; it matters what the arguments are. And so I kind of like that about him. because I was asking about scholarly consensus because I just wanted to know, with a barometer, like, where is this going? But he told me, yeah, what matters is the arguments. So, yeah, I would say that at least he encouraged disagreement, and I would also, or yeah, disagreement and opened up that floor. There's also one professor at Harvard who I'll also leave unnamed, who actually has some very interesting views on like the Hebrew Bible, and this person's actually on the more conservative end of things, and so, but he's also, but they're also brilliant, right? I mean, so they can't just be dismissed as being a hack or a loony, right? This person actually knows Hebrew very, very well, and is a kind of genius, and so um, there are interesting views at the divinity school, and it's interesting to see like they. Okay, so there's a lot that I can say. Anyway, how do you personally feel about disagreeing with it? So I don't have a problem disagreeing with the scholarly consensus as long as I think I have good reasons to do so, or at least if I can tell that the scholarly consensus doesn't seem to be well founded. So I think it just always matters, do you have a good reason for doing this? Of course, the whole point of a scholarly consensus is, you don't ever want to really be on the fringe of things because, I mean, sometimes you have to be innovative, but sometimes, it's a kind of helpful epistemic guide to just see where the consensus is, to see where your colleagues are, and to work with them rather than always against them. So even if maybe you disagree with the consensus, um, you want to at least know, why do they believe it? Why is this a consensus? It's kind of like, for example, in conservative political thought, you don't, before you take down a fence, you want to first know why it's there. And so that's kind of my thinking here. I don't want to just dismiss it either. Callum S says Gary Habermas has the first volume of his new book out this month, 1,000-page volume. Try and get him on. That's a great idea, actually. I know that Gary Habermas was coming out with that, but I didn't know when it was going to finally be released. But I think if I can get him on, that would be great. A while back, I did email him, so like years ago, so not like that recently. Yeah, you know what? Oh, this is so tempting. Oh no. I'm this broke academic student and I'm trying to save money, but this looks so good. Wow. Wow, look at that. Anyway, whoops. um, what do you think about what do you think of the minimal facts versus maximal data debate? Okay, so this is complicated because with respect to the minimal facts, I think the minimal facts are important, right? So that has to be a part of the case for the resurrection. You want to know what is the historical bedrock, like what things happened, what didn't happen, what things didn't happen. But I also want to say here that things like the empty tomb, even if there, okay, this is actually a good point. Even if there isn't a scholarly consensus on the empty tomb, I think Habermas places the percentage around 70 to 75%, which in order to count as consensus for Habermas, it has to hit, I think, 90 and above. I actually think that the case for the empty tomb is good. I know I've listened to Paulogia, and I think Myth Vision has touched on this too. And I appreciate their criticisms, and I think that they have interesting arguments. But I really do think that Dale Allison has pointed out that if there wasn't an empty tomb and Jesus was just buried in a common grave like other criminals, then there's a passage, I think, in Isaiah 53 where it talks about how the righteous one is buried alongside like the unrighteous dead or something like that. And if that's the case, and then Allison makes the argument that why wouldn't Christians then have used that Isaiah apologetic then to buttress their point? But in fact, they don't. And I think the best explanation is that there had to have been something like an empty tomb for Jesus. So regarding now maximal data, I think maximal data is interesting, because what the maximal data approach tries to do, and I'm trying my best to be fair here. So if I make a mistake, please correct me in the comments or later in another video. The maximal data approach is trying to show that the Gospels are, in general, robust and reliable eyewitness testimony. And because they have this knack and this mark of reliability, such as undesigned coincidences, you can trust them even on this point on the resurrection of Jesus. So I think that's what the maximal data approach is trying to do. Um, Personally, for me, like, I guess my approach to the resurrection, my approach to the resurrection is more Swinburnian, right? So I like Swinburne's approach because he begins with the nature of God. he begins with then the incarnation, he builds up, and then he includes some minimal facts. And I think you can also throw in some maximal, some value from the maximal data approach as well, in order to like get across this very, to get across this idea of that the resurrection in fact did happen if you do the Bayesian calculation and all that. So yes, I don't know if I would really say I'm on either camp. I like both, and I think you should combine the strengths of both, and then add in Swinburne to get the final mix that you need. Kevin Nunstratacath says, not just Jews, right? Second century Christians are reading the Gospel of Nicodemus as if it were canonical per Justin Martyr. Yeah, I mean, so just going back to my point about how ancient Jews, they had the canonical text, but they also had other texts like Jubilees, and others that claim to be written by Moses, or at least have traditions going back to Moses, and they read them equally alongside Scripture. So yes, it's. I think I mentioned that early Christians also did that as well. So let's see here. Hello and love from a Hindu from India, IP. Your intellectual and broad minded approach to faith is truly inspiring. Thank you for watching this channel. I appreciate it. Oh, and he says, happy, or I don't know, he or she. Oh, by the way, happy New Year, everyone. May 2024 bring a flood of wonderful moments to you, your loved ones, and all the living beings who are facing tribulations right now. Thank you for that. Callum S says, philosophically inclined people should not be scared of challenging a consensus if the challenge rests on arguments. Exactly. I say this as someone with a background in non-religious history. That's great. That's good to know. And that's a spot on point. Is there much point in non-expert individual religious debates? It seems, oh, and this is a white vortex. It seems that each side has a lot of reasoning for its position and hard for someone who is not well informed to counter enough points. That's an interesting question. So this is the way that I view it. I think that intellectuals and experts have a public service component. That is to say that they are public servants, and that they bring in, they do their hard academic research, and in the guild, so to speak, they argue with each other, refine their points. And then they bring the fruits of their good labor, right? The things that have been tested and have been really rigorously analyzed, and they bring those good fruits. They should bring those good fruits to the public, and in an accessible way. And so I think that for non-expert individuals, they can actually learn a lot. And it's the job of public intellectuals to be honest. If I know like some people might laugh at that, and I understand, but it's the job of public intellectuals to bring this information and good knowledge to people, so that in their non-expert individual religious debates, they have the best data, they have the most refined conclusions in the most clear way possible. I think that would be so I think that's still helpful. So what I would say actually is that for non-expert individual non-expert individuals who are engaging in religious debates, that doesn't excuse you from doing the homework and trying to find the good sources and being fair. I think if you have that virtue within you of being, these intellectual virtues of being rigorous, of being fair, of being charitable, I think that can take you a very long way. And so I think there is value because, you can't have somebody do your own thinking for you, but you can have somebody do the research and help you, right? Along the way. And so I think there is value, but you need to have the right virtues. And I think that if you have the right virtues and you're going to good sources, then actually non-expert individual religious debates can be very productive and valuable. Let's see here. Okay, IP, thank you for telling me that part. And let's see, Callum S says, very fair. I would say that the maximal data approach fundamentally rests on the Gospels and Acts, reliably reflecting what the disciples claimed. Yeah, that's good. So it goes back to the historical text testimony rather than like it being some later legendary development or added on. Okay, well, I think that's every question that I have so far. And with that, I think maybe I'll just end the episode. But I'm definitely, man, I'm so sorry. I was actually sick from New Year's. I said that on a YouTube community post that I was hanging out with my Pentecostal cousins, and I think like I don't want to blame this on them, but I think I was very eventually like I think the trip was just it was fun, but it was a lot, and so I was kind of tired and I got a little sick, and so I'm not blaming them for anything. I'm just saying that that's just what happened, and so it kind of took me out for a few days. happy to be back, and I'm happy to be continuing doing this with intellectual Catholicism. Many more videos ahead. So I'm very excited to be back. And thank you for watching this impromptu stream. I know that I would usually want to give you more time to prepare, but I just got too excited and I was like, yo, I need to do this again. So anyway, much more to come. And thank you for watching today's stream. God bless.